EC. Call 0345 6060 973.
We've got 11 minutes before 8 is the time, just while we wait to hear from Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. Let's go back to some of your views and comments on the care home scandal. We now know it's official, the High Court ruling that the government acted illegally or unlawfully in moving people from hospitals. They were untested, elderly and vulnerable people, into care homes. Of course, there is the other argument that elderly people and indeed vulnerable people was best to get them away from hospitals because obviously people were going in with COVID there. But sending them untested is one of the key issues. This is what you're saying on the text, tweets and emails. Dave in Dover. My wife runs a dementia care home and never had a single case of COVID during the pandemic. She locked it down like Fort Knox, refused to take anyone who'd been in hospital without a negative test. I assure you hospitals were trying everything they could think to discharge elderly patients back into the community then as they do now. Well, that's a tremendous success story then that your wife managed to achieve, Dave, so credit to her for that. This same subject, James in Tiverton in Devon, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't the government blame the care home staff for spreading the problem and letting the patients down? Well, I do remember at the time that we said as and when inquiries, and of course there will still be inquiries into the whole handling of the COVID, and while I think they will feature in favourable terms the way the government was able to get the vaccine, to develop the vaccine and then get it into so many arms so quickly, courtesy in some instances of the military who stepped in. While that is on the positive side, without question, you have to say that on the negative side, two big problems was the lack of PPE kit. And in fact, one newspaper, the Daily Mail, bringing in more than the government did for a short time. I mean, that was quite incredible. And then this care home, which it was you that made me aware of that, or made all of us aware of that, with your stories of your, in some instances, elderly relatives, in other instances, just relatives and loved ones, being taken in without any form of testing. And clearly it couldn't possibly be right. Same subject. This is from Margaret in Surrey. At the beginning of COVID, no one knew how ill, I think you mean ill, you've put how ill we would all become with it. The verdict is unfair regarding the deaths in care homes. Matt Hancock is not to blame. Well, he did, of course, say, remember he kept talking about that protective ring? And they must have been getting notification of how difficult it was looking. Jerome in Kingston, you mentioned the asymptomatic transmission of COVID and who knew what and when. There was a suspicion of asymptomatic transmission as early as March 2020, but the signs were dismissed in the UK with the argument there's no definitive proof. That's the excuse being used. I remember in the UK, the doctor saying there was no evidence when Olivier Véran, the French health minister, who's also a doctor, said there was high suspicion COVID was being asymptomatically transmitted in schools. He is the man who first flagged the loss of smell and taste symptoms, which was also initially dismissed by the UK. But I didn't know that was dismissed. There's a link from a French government website dated March 4th, 2020, where they are talking about care homes and the need to be extremely vigilant when children are visiting, because children are likely to transmit the virus and be asymptomatic. Well, thank you, Jerome. You've certainly done a lot of research and you've given me that link. I will have a look at it later. I don't have time to open it now, obviously, because we're talking about it. But that would seem to say, again, that the government should have behaved in a better fashion. This comes in from Sally. Regarding your comment on Patrick Vallance warning the government, check Twitter. The Health and Social Care Committee reporting on the 5th of May directly from him, and in fact read the further comments from Jenny Harris, no fan of the government. He makes a reference to it having an impact. Care homes are a bit different. They both say that until the end of the pandemic, we won't really be able to understand how COVID works. I'm no stooge, right, Sally, but hindsight is a wonderful thing. This obsession with judicial reviews and court cases and the desire to blame people for an unknown virus where everyone makes the same mistake is simply wrong. OK, that's a lengthy conversation to which we might return, but let's go now to the story that I mentioned. It's leading the LBC website and it leads the Times. The possibility that the Ukraine war could carry on for years, possibly even 10 years. This coming from the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss. Defence Secretary Ben Wallace joins me now. Good to have you on. Do you concur with your senior colleague, Secretary of State? Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. Well, look, certainly if Russia recognises that it's losing, it could do another strategy, which is to effectively dig in, fortify what it's got. make it some form of frozen conflict. And if you cast your mind back to 2014, having invaded illegally Crimea and the Donetsk, it basically set up a line of defences and hunkered down and used snipers to just pick off members of the Ukrainian army. 11,000 actually were killed over those sort of last 8 years. So it could definitely do that and turn it effectively into a sort of slow-moving, frozen occupation, like a sort of cancerous growth in Ukraine. And I think that's why it's very important that we assist the Ukrainians get the limpet off the rock, effectively, make sure they don't put down their roots and try to dig in. And the reason the Russians have been desperately fighting for Mariupol, which they will boast and say today that they have captured, they still don't have total control of that town, some 60-odd days into the conflict, but is because they are trying to secure the nearly 400 kilometres of road from the Russian border to Crimea to link up the two areas they invaded in 2014. And you'll see today they're going to take some quote-unquote journalists to Mariupol, where I think they will tell the world that, of course, that was all done by Nazis and Ukrainians. Of course, you won't be allowed to go because anyone who has a different opinion will not be allowed. But then they will have a very difficult challenge over the next few months or years, which is how do you actually hold a road that is that long?
Let's go to Russia. We're, 9-10 days away from what normally is their big parade day. They remember their past victories. What do you think they've got planned? How do you imagine they're going to reference the Ukraine war in 10 days' time, Secretary of State?
Well, I think we've seen a number of statements from Putin recently about this is becoming a war, this is a proxy war, which it isn't, this is, everyone, Nazis are everywhere, basically. There's not just in Ukraine, the NATO is full of Nazis. And I think what he's going to try and do is he's going to move from his quote-unquote special operation. He's been rolling the pitch, laying the ground for being able to say, look, this is now a war against Nazis, and what I need is more people. I need more Russian cannon fodder, basically. His generals have led so many to their deaths already that I would not be surprised, and I don't have any information about this, that he is probably going to declare on this May Day that we're now at war with the world's Nazis and we need to mass mobilize the Russian people, which is actually a pathetic attempt to cover for the fact that that actually his generals have sent thousands of men to their deaths because of their incompetence and arrogance and his ego. And I think that's what we're seeing. I mean, the saber rattling is actually quite consistent. He might use different words, but he's been banging on like that for a good few weeks now. I think that's what he's teeing up, because actually to mass mobilize the Russian sort of reserves is an admission of failure, from a man who thought he'd get Ukraine in a couple of days. So he's going to try and link it, I think, with the Second World War and make out. And he, if you want to read a disturbing piece of writing, he wrote an article in 2020 about the Soviet Union's role in the Second World War, and that basically they saved the world and it was nothing to do with us. He completely lost out the massacre of Polish officers, and 20,000 of them, I think, by Russians. He forgets Britain was on its own from 39 to 41. That they don't count. So that's the delusion this man's in.
Revisionist history. If we come up to date, or at least to yesterday, he promised to use weapons in a lightning strike against anyone who interferes with his plans in Ukraine. Should my listeners be concerned? Do you feel rattled by Putin's threats, Secretary of State?
I don't feel rattled by it because we have strong armed forces and nuclear deterrent, and we're part of a nation, a NATO partnership of 30 nations who outgun him, outnumber him, and have potentially all the capabilities at our disposal. So I don't fear him. I think we should be very grateful in this country that we have a nuclear deterrent. I think that is a really important part of his calculations. There are many, as we know, who wanted to get rid of it over the years. I am very grateful that he, somewhere under the sea, some amazing men and women are deep underwater, hiding, waiting in case Britain needs protected. I think that's important. But
do you think he will go nuclear, Mr. Wallace?
I don't think he will. I think the biggest challenge of my job is those judgments, is the calibration of our assistance to Ukraine, where the consequences are real. I think there are very few decisions. I remember Margaret Thatcher sent a task force to the Falklands. She didn't really know the outcome of that. Winston Churchill, in his time, when he decided not to sue for peace, took a decision. it's nothing on that scale for us, but it is clearly we're dealing with a very unpredictable man who is behaving often irrationally. What is the case is usually his decisions backfire. So his so-called lightning invasion of Ukraine hasn't gone too well, and his sort of strategic boasts of bullying. So yesterday he announced, I think, cutting off gas to Bulgaria and Poland. Well, Bulgaria was one of those countries that right up until the threat and yesterday were sort of on the fence because they had a government that was split. Well, that's had a complete backfire. Bulgaria said, OK, well, if you're going to switch off my gas, we're going to support Ukraine. So he makes massive strategic blunders. Look at Finland and Sweden potentially joining NATO, all the things he doesn't want. And I think what we mustn't do, and we must do all the efforts we can to get the truth into Russia, is let him repaint this as somehow him against the Nazis and that he's the virtuous.
Last couple of points, 2 other matters. Do you think Durham Police needs to take another look at whether Sir Keir Starmer had friends with him when he had a slice of pizza and a beer?
No, I certainly think there should be a consistency of the application of the law. That's what we all deserve, whoever we are, whether we're in London or whether we're in Durham. I saw the photographs, Keir Starmer standing with a bottle of beer with a whole group of people. If that is defined as a illegal gathering in Downing Street, then I'm not quite sure why that isn't viewed as an illegal gathering in Durham. No doubt the police will look at it. They'll base their views on evidence. It will be entirely for them and a consultation with the CPS to make the decision. But I think overall, it's one of the big challenges with COVID. And we've obviously had yesterday, the ruling in the High Court about Matt Hancock and care homes. And I think it's very easy in hindsight to forget, all of us were trying to do our very best. All of us, from the most junior nurse to the most senior politician, people were trying to find a way through a pandemic of a virus we didn't really know the details of how to treat and how to deal with it. And in hindsight, there will be lots of lessons, which is why we're having an inquiry. But, it somehow, the danger is we somehow get into a narrative if it was all deliberate and everyone wanted people to suffer. No one did.
All right. I mean, Mr. Hancock had an interesting way of dealing with stress at some times during that time. Lastly, it's reported that a Conservative MP has possibly been viewing porn while in the House of Commons. Were this to be the case, he should lose his seat, shouldn't he?
Well, who loses the seat is a matter for their constituents. We, in our system, quite rightly,
he should lose the whip.
He could lose the whip.
No, I say he should.
Well, let's see if the cases prove. I certainly think it's unacceptable to look at pornography in the workplace. Whether you're in the House of Commons or whether you're in the BBC, you shouldn't be looking at pornography when you're paid to do another job. So I think first and foremost, if it is found or proven, then the person should be disciplined. It's unacceptable. Partly because they're paid to do a job of being the MP and representing citizens, but partly because of the offence. If it caused offence to people sitting next to them, that's not acceptable in a workplace.
And have the whip withdrawn.
I think that's one of the sanctions. I think we'll leave it to the investigation. It could be worse. I mean, if the Commons authorities feel it is egregious enough, he could end up having a recall petition in his constituency or be suspended from Parliament. There's lots of different ways, but withdrawing the whip is a certain possibility. It would be sort of something I would support, that he loses the whip if that is the case. But let's see how the facts develop in the investigation.
Always grateful for your time. Thank you, Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, appearing here on LBC, where at 2 minutes after 8, Thomas Watts has the latest news headlines.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has used a major speech to say Russian forces must be pushed out of the whole of Ukraine. She's described a victory for Kiev as a strategic imperative, in the strongest indication yet of the UK's objectives for the war. Ms Truss has also warned the conflict